Okay, so what we're going to do here is talk about what you need to know in order to do a workshop which is called Practical Promises. So one thing that one thing that we really have to do is that you have to realize that you can't really understand what promises solve until you start getting into situations where you're working with callbacks and you start looking at your callback code and it starts to become kind of complicated. So just as an example, I actually pulled up a block of code from something that we had done in one of our Cloud 9 sessions. And this is just something to keep in mind before we end up looking at exactly what promises do. But here we actually have a route that we're defining, where if we end up going to this route, and this is actually a nested route, where we're giving the ID of a company, and we're going to find information both about the company and about the employees. And what we've done here is that our database has an asynchronous method, and the way that we're dealing with the asynchronous method is with callbacks. We'll find out that promises are an alternative, and quite often a better alternative than dealing with callbacks, because one of the problems that we had, and this was something that I had commented on and you might have seen in the code, is that we're going and we're getting the employees of a company, and we're passing in the ID of the company and we're getting back the employees, and immediately after we do that, we end up making another asynchronous call. Again, all of these are asynchronous. That's a result of the SQLite library that we were working with, where we're interacting with the database. So all these things are asynchronous. And so as a result, what ends up happening is that we have these nested calls. Now, you could think about it and say, hey, look, there's no dependency on these calls. I could call these two things independently. Some people have actually done that. So you could call them independently. Now, we don't know what order they'll end up coming back in. And so there's some work that we'd have to do to make sure, in fact, that we were actually getting back both results. Now, the only reason I'm running them one after the other, which would be considered serially, is that I really don't have a choice because I don't have any promise library to work with. But using promises would end up solving this problem. So when we end up talking about promises, what we're really going to be replacing are callbacks. Now, there are still callbacks involved, but instead of calling a function and passing in another function, we're going to end up using promises where we're going to be getting something back from the function that we call. So before we end up, going into this in detail, let's just talk a little bit about callbacks, because, you might think that all callbacks are asynchronous, but that's not necessarily the case. There's two types of callbacks that we end up dealing with: blocking and non-blocking. So you could think about the blocking callbacks, right, where they're not asynchronous. Things like the array method has an array has a filter method, and filter will end up getting called on each element in the array, and that's not going to be an asynchronous operation. That's going to happen in line, and the predicate function is going to get called on each item that's in the array, similar to an array sort method and similar to an iterator, which takes an array and returns another array, and it does it with an iterator function. But again, all these are blocking callbacks, so there's nothing asynchronous about them. The callbacks end up getting called immediately. And when we end up thinking about non-blocking callbacks, things are a little bit different. Now, you've seen some of these non-blocking callbacks before. We ended up, in the game of life, we ended up looking at event handlers. So when a button gets clicked on, there's some function that ends up getting called, right? So we pass in this function. Nothing is being blocked when we pass in this function. In fact, this function might never end up getting called back if nobody ever ends up clicking on the button, right? So these would fall under the category of a non-blocking callback. We actually have used callbacks, right, which are non-blocking, in setting up middleware for Express, where we could specify app.use, or we just saw an example of app.get, where there's some function that's going to be called back based upon whether your particular route ends up matching the middleware, right? And we have this middleware pipeline that ends up getting called until you either end up getting down to the end of the express pipeline, or in fact you've returned the response. So in these cases, we're dealing with callbacks, which are asynchronous, really, but they're not blocking. As opposed to when we think of what would be sort of the vanilla asynchronous callback. So this is another one that we've used. The FS object has a read file method, and it's going to be interacting with it's going to be reading a file from a disk. And as a result of the fact that you have JavaScript is single-threaded, what ends up happening is that when we end up calling read file, this method was structured in a way where we pass it a callback. And this callback will get called either when there's an error reading the file or we are done reading the file. And this is the type of async callback that we're going to deal with when we end up dealing with promises. So again, we've got these two flavors, this blocking and non-blocking, and the one that we're going to be focused on when we end up dealing with promises is going to be this vanilla asynchronous callback. Again, think of that whole idea of reading a file, where instead of reading a file, we can set things up so that instead of passing in a callback, we can have a function that goes to read a file, and we end up getting a promise, and then we can end up dealing with the result of that promise, and we'll look at an example of that. So if we end up thinking about some code that might be structured like this, where we're calling set timeout, and we've got this callback function, and we're assigning result inside this function, we're going to have a problem here. And the problem that we're going to have is that this console log result is going to end up getting called first, even though we have 0 as a set timeout, and we're not going to get the result that we think we're going to end up getting, right? So this is going to end up being problematic. Another thing that people sometimes do, and this is a little bit of a difference between these two. One of them, we're assigning the variable result, and we're attempting to write it out. Again, this is not going to work. Result is going to be undefined. A lot of times people will think, well, what you could end up doing is returning something from this callback. But that's not going to end up accomplishing anything either. What's going to happen here is that we are assigning this set timeout to this result, right? And so this is not going to have the desired impact that we're looking for as well. In fact, we expect that the console.log is going to end up writing out hello, but it's not going to work here, because if you have something that's asynchronous, an asynchronous function, it's never really going to make any sense to return anything from it. So the way that this is going to have to be structured is that if you have a set timeout and you have something, in this case, that something is happening asynchronously, right, you're going to have to get your result first, and then you have the ability to console log something out to the screen. So that's going to be the correct way that you're going to do it. So in terms of the definition of a promise represents the eventual result of an asynchronous operation. There's something that's happening asynchronously, and there's going to be a result of that happening. And the way that the promise libraries end up working is that if you have something that is asynchronous, so for instance here, if we have this read file method, right, we know that we're passing in a callback, as opposed to if we had something that was asynchronous and returned a promise. The way that you could tell if something ends up returning a promise is it's what would be called venable. Venable, T-H-E-N. So when you end up getting a promise at some point, okay, you're going to have a result. And whatever callback you end up putting in this then method will get called only after whatever was asynchronous has been completed. So it's a little bit of a flip in a way that instead of passing in a callback function, you're holding on to a promise again, you still have a callback function. In fact, in this case, we might even have, again, the way that this might be set up, you could have a on-success handler or an on-error handler. But very often things are done a little bit differently, where if there's an error, you'll end up having a catch that'll get called on a promise. But the big difference here is that you're in control. You're going to get back something that has a then method on it. And again, this is just the way that the promise specifications are written. And you're going to be able to put a function in here, and it's that function that's going to end up getting called. So, for instance, if you had this sort of permissified set timeout method, so let's just say that under the covers, we had some method where we were going to set a timeout. And this was going to end up returning a promise. And after whatever was that set period of time, we had a function, and we ended up getting a result back. Or in this case, we don't get a result back. We just have a delay. This is going to put us in the exact same state that we were before. Because, again, the callback is really going to end up happening when this permissified set timeout determines that it's done. And when it's done, this callback function inside of the then will end up getting called. So, again, the way that this would end up getting structured, and again, this is just a variation of the same thing that we saw before. This is really not going to end up doing anything either, because it's not going to be able to return anything here. So this is going to give us that same result. And what we really want to do, the same thing that you did with sort of the plain vanilla callback, is to not use your result until you end up having your result. So again, the logic would dictate here that this is going to get called back rather quickly. When it gets called back, we could end up assigning this result variable, and then we could end up logging out this result variable. So if we sort of talk about a synchronous operation and we end up comparing it, so here's an example. We set up a path, and we're going to console.log immediately I'm first. And the way that this is going to work is that the read file sync method doesn't take a callback. The read file sync method is going to read a file, and it's going to tie up your thread. It's not something that you really want to do. I think in most cases this would not be a very good practice, but in this case, what we're going to end up getting back is we're going to end up getting back a buffer, and you could actually even set this so that you could actually specify that you're reading a UTF-8 file, and in that case you would be able to just do console.log buff instead of console.log buff to string. But you can see in this case, if we have a problem reading a file, the reason why this is in a try-catch block is that if there's a problem reading the file, we want to be able to handle the error. So, in this case, the way that this would end up reading, because this is in fact synchronous, you're going to get first, and either you're going to get the file getting written out, or you're going to get an error, and then you're going to end up getting console.log last. As opposed to if we end up using the read file method, which is asynchronous and should be the way that you should end up reading a file, you can see that this console.log I am first is in fact going to happen first. And there's going to be some delay in terms of reading a file because, again, it's going to end up happening from another thread. Again, the whole idea that the JavaScript is going to be single-threaded, but the Node environment is not. So in this case, a file will end up getting read. If the file is a shorter file, it'll get read faster. If it's a longer file, it'll probably take a little bit longer. And if there's an error reading the file, your callback, this is a very common pattern, is either to get the first parameter is going to be an error, and the second parameter is going to be your result. So again, in this case, the console.log is, you're going to see I am first, you're going to see the results of your file, and then you're going to end up seeing I am last. If we think about this in terms of how this would end up getting set up with by using promises, what you really have is you have the ability, and this is kind of the first time where we've seen a couple of thens here, But where if you had some method that would return a promise, this is something that you could create if it didn't exist. You could create it by using a promise library and a combination of the promise library and the fs read file function. But here you have the path of a file, and you're calling it. You're calling this permissified method with that path of the file. And the way that this works is that when something is a promise, you could pass in two different functions here. The first function would deal with if things were successful. The second function would deal with when there was an error. And so the way that this would end up working, which is kind of interesting, is that let's assume that you were able to read the file. You're going to end up console logging the contents of the file. This second event handler with the error never gets called. Okay? It only gets called if there's an error. But once it gets called, it'll go through to the next then. So if this was being read successfully, what you would see is, again, because this is asynchronous, you'd see the same thing you saw in all these other examples. You'd see I am first. You would end up seeing the contents of the file, and then you would see I am last. What's also interesting about this, if there was an error, you would again see I am first. You would see the error, and you would end up seeing I am last. And one of the things that this tells you is that this gives you the ability to actually go from one then to the next then. So, and one thing that we'll end up looking at is how we can end up passing data from one promise to the next promise, which really makes this a very powerful thing. So, big advantage of promises is that they're going to be portable, meaning if you have a promise, you could end up returning the promise, and someone else could end up using that promise. You could have multiple handlers. You could have this unified error handling that you're dealing with. So you could deal with if you end up having an error, and if you want to, you could go right back on path with, you could handle the error, and you could still go through your promise chain with these multiple thens. And you have this whole idea of things being linear. And again, that's nice because you don't get into this scenario with having these nested callbacks. So there's a bunch of implementations, promise libraries that you deal with. There's a few that I've worked with. I've worked with the Q library. This is a library that ends up shipping with Angular. jQuery has a promise library, which is actually maligned quite a bit, which probably won't be working with. But the one that we're going to be working with is going to be the Bluebird library. And so one of the ways that we would end up dealing with our scenario here when we were dealing with this sort of nested promise library, these two nested calls, the way that we would end up dealing with that is that the Bluebird library actually has the ability to say, hey, look, there's two promises that you're working with. Now, again, it's not going to work with callbacks, but if we restructured our library, so get employees by company, return the promise, and so that get company, return the promise, we'd have the ability to say to the Bluebird library, hey, Bluebird library, we don't really care what the order is, really, but we really only want to deal with when both these promises are satisfied. And so in that case, the promise libraries become pretty helpful. Here we would have a problem if we wanted to run these. Again, the big issue here is we're sort of nesting these, running one right after the other, when we really could run them serially. And that's what we're going to end up, focusing on, is how these different libraries implement promises and how you could end up using them to execute asynchronous code. And so that's what the next workshop is going to be dealing with.